If one phantom is more discredited than any other, it is the Cock Lane ghost. The ghost has been a proverb for impudent trickery and stern exposure, yet its history remains a puzzle. The very people who exposed the ghost were well aware that their explanation was worthless and frankly admitted the fact. Yet there were plenty of observers in and around London who were prepared to believe that the phenomena were produced by the spirit of Miss Fanny Lang, known after her decease as Scratching Fanny. The quaint old London Church of St. Sepulchre could not by any stretch of the imagination be called a fashionable place of worship. It stood in a crowded quarter of the city, and the gentry were content to leave it to the humble working people who made up its parish. Now and again a stray antiquarian paid it a fleeting visit, but generally the coming of a stranger was so rare as to be accounted an event. It is easy to understand the sensation occasioned by the appearance at prayers one morning, in 1759, of a young and well-dressed couple whose natural habitat was obviously in quite other surroundings. As they waited in the aisle, the man tall, sturdy, and easy of bearing, the woman fair and graceful, there was an instant craning of necks and vast nudging of one's neighbor. Probably no one felt a more lively interest than did the parish clerk, who, in showing them to a pew, had noted the tenderness with which they regarded each other. As soon as the congregation was dismissed and he perceived that the visitors were lingering in their places, he hurried forward and accosted them. His name was Parsons and he was officiating clerk of the parish. He would be delighted if he could serve them in any way. "Possibly you can," said the man. "My name is Knight, and this lady is my wife. We have only recently come to London and are in search of lodgings. If you know of any good place to which you can recommend us, we shall be heartily obliged to you." Whatever he was, Clerk Parsons was not a fool, and these few words showed him plainly that he was face to face with a mystery. Such a well-born couple would not from choice bury themselves in this forbidding section of London. "We are willing to pay a reasonable charge, and shall require only a bedroom and a sitting room. If possible, we should prefer to be where there are no other lodgers." "In that case," responded the clerk, with an eagerness he could scarcely veil, "I can accommodate you in my own house." To Clerk Parsons's joy they decided to make their home with him. Nor did their coming gladden the clerk alone. His wife and children, two little girls of 9 and 10, from the moment they saw the beautiful lady conceived a warm attachment for her. Her geniality, her kindliness, her manifest love for her husband, appealed to their sympathies, as did the sadness which from time to time clouded her face. They soon became convinced that she and her husband shared some momentous secret. For the husband too they entertained the friendliest feelings. He was of a blunt, outspoken disposition and perhaps a trifle quick-tempered, but he was frank and sincerely devoted to his wife. For all in the household the days passed pleasantly. When Mrs. Parsons one fine spring morning discovered her fair guest in tears, she felt that time had established between them relations sufficiently confidential to warrant her motherly intervention. In a voice shaken by sobs, Fanny now unfolded her story, and pitiful enough it was. She was the sister of Knight's first wife, who had died in Norfolk, leaving a newborn child that survived its mother only a few hours. At Knight's request she then went to keep house for him, and presently they found themselves very much in love with each other. But in the canon law they discovered an insuperable obstacle to marriage. Had the wife died without issue, or had her child not been born alive, the law would have permitted her, even though a deceased wife's sister, to wed the man of her choice. As things stood, a legitimate union was out of the question. Learning this, they resolved to separate. But separation brought only increased longing. Thence grew a rapid and mutual persuasion that under the circumstances it would be no sin to bid defiance to the canon law and live together as man and wife. This view not finding favor with their relatives, and becoming apprehensive of arrest and imprisonment, they had fled to London and had hidden themselves in its depths. This confession, though it did not in the least diminish her landlady's regard for her, worked indirectly in a most disastrous way. Whether driven by necessity, or emboldened by the belief that his lodgers were at his mercy, the clerk soon afterward approached Knight for a small loan. Obtaining it, he repeated the request on several other occasions until he had borrowed in all about £12. Payment he postponed on one pretext and another until the lender finally lost all patience and informed him roundly that he must settle or stand suit. Then followed an interchange of words that in an instant terminated the pleasant connection of the preceding months. Parsons was described as an impudent scoundrel who would be taught what honesty meant. Parsons described himself as knowing what honesty meant full well, and needing no lessons from a fugitive from justice. White with rage, Knight bundled his belongings together, called a hackney coach, and within the hour had shaken the dust of Cock Lane from his feet, finding new lodgings in Clerkenwell and at once hauling his former landlord to the debtor's court. A little time passed and all else was forgotten in the serious illness of his beloved Fanny. At first the physician declared that the malady would prove slight, but she herself seemed to feel that she was doomed. She urged them to send for a lawyer so she might make her last will and testament. To humor her, the will was drawn. But now it developed that the disease which had attacked her was smallpox in its worst form, and she soon passed on. They buried her in the vaults of St. John's, Clerkenwell, and from her tomb her husband came forth to give battle to the relatives who, shunning her while alive, did not disdain to seek possession of the small legacy she had left him. In this they failed, but scarcely had the smoke of the legal battle cleared away, before he was called upon to meet a new issue so unexpected and so mysterious, that history affords no stranger sequel to a tale of love. Before the bitter separation occurred, it chanced that Mr. Knight left Fanny alone in Cock Lane while he went to a wedding in the country. She asked little Elizabeth Parsons, her landlord's daughter, to share her bed, and both of them were disturbed by strange scratching and rapping. Poor Fanny pronounced it an omen of her early death. The mysterious sounds began to manifest themselves in the Parsons home soon after Fanny died. These were attributed by Mrs. Parsons to the industry of a neighboring cobbler, but when they occurred on a Sunday, this theory was abandoned. Mr. Parsons in vain took down the wainscoting to see whether some mischievous neighbor produced the sounds. Scratching was usually the first manifestation in this affair. The raps and scratches seemed to come on the bed of little Elizabeth Parsons. A Mr. Brown was an early investigator and published his report. He asked the ghost to reply, affirmatively or negatively, to questions, by one knock for yes, two for no. This method was suggested by Mary Fraser, in attendance on the child. Thus it was elicited that Fanny had been poisoned by Mr. Knight with red arsenic in a glass of port to which she was partial, and if the spirit could be believed, the earlier knocking had been due to the agency of her dead sister. She added that she wished to see Mr. Knight hanged. Her chief effects were raps, scratching, and a sound as of whirring wings, which filled the room. These Cock Lane occurrences were attributed to ventriloquism, but, after a surgeon had held his hand on the child's stomach and chest while the noises were being produced, this explanation was abandoned. The first intimation of its coming and of its nature was revealed to Knight, as to the public generally, by a brief paragraph printed in a January 1762 issue of the London Ledger.
For some time past a great knocking has been heard in the night at the officiating parish clerks of St. Sepulchre's in Cock Lane near Smithfield, to the great terror of the family. All means were used to discover the meaning of it. 4 gentlemen sat up there last Friday night, among whom was a clergyman who asked various questions. On his asking whether anyone had been murdered, no answer was made. But on his asking whether anyone had been poisoned, it knocked 31 times. The report current in the neighborhood is that a woman was some time ago poisoned, and buried at St. John's, Clerkenwell by her brother-in-law.
Instantly the city was agog, and for the next fortnight the newspapers gave much of their space to details of the pretended revelations. In commenting on this amazing story, the papers were prompt to point out that the knocking was heard only in the presence of the aforementioned daughter, now a girl of 12. While 1 or 2 inclined to credence, the majority denounced the affair as an imposture. The outraged husband, as may be imagined, lost not a moment in demanding admission to the séances which were proceeding merrily under the direction of a servant in the Parsons family and a clergyman of the neighborhood. He found that the method practiced was to put the girl to bed, wait until the knocking began, and then question the alleged spirit. As reported in the Daily Gazetteer, which had promised that the reader may expect to be enlightened from time to the utmost of our power in this intricate and dark affair, her maid was found and from her was procured a sworn statement that Mrs. Knight had said not a word to her about being poisoned. Indeed, she had become unconscious 12 hours before her death and remained unconscious to the end. The physician and apothecary who had attended her made affidavit to the same effect, and described the fatal nature of her illness. It was further shown that her death at most benefited Knight by not more than £100, of which he had no need, as he was of independent means. Altogether, he would seem to have cleared himself effectually. Still the knocking continued, and night after night the accusation was repeated. He now resorted to a radical step to convince the public that he was the victim of a monstrous fraud. Asserting that little Miss Parsons herself produced the mysterious sounds, and that she did so at the instigation of her father, he secured an order for her removal to the house of a friend of his, a Clerkenwell clergyman. Here a decisive failure was recorded against the ghost. It had promised that it would knock on the coffin containing Mrs. Knight's remains, and about 1 o'clock in the morning the entire company adjourned to the church. Only one member was found of sufficient boldness to plunge with Knight into the gloomy depths where the dead lay entombed, and that one bore out his statement that never a knock had been heard. The girl was urged to confess, but persisted in her assertions that the ghost was in no wise of her making. When the knocking had been resumed under more favorable auspices, word came from the unseen world that the fiasco in the church was ascribable to the very good reason that Knight had caused his wife's coffin to be secretly removed. With clergyman, sexton and undertaker, he visited the vaults once more and not only identified but opened the coffin. Meanwhile all London was flocking to Cock Lane as to a show, on foot, on horseback, in vehicles of every description. Some were animated by scientific zeal, but idle curiosity inspired the great majority. The gossiping Horace Walpole has left a graphic picture of the stir created by the newspaper reports.
I went to hear it, for it is not an apparition but an audition. We set out from the opera, changed our clothes at Northumberland House, the Duke of York, Lady Northumberland, Lady Mary Coke, Lord Hertford, and I, all in one hackney coach, and drove to the spot. It rained in torrents, yet the lane was full of mob, and the house so full we could not get in. At last they discovered it was the Duke of York, and the company squeezed themselves into one another's pockets, to make room for us. The house, which is borrowed, and to which the ghost has adjourned, is wretchedly small and miserable. When we opened the chamber, in which were 50 people with no light but one tallow candle at the end, we tumbled over the bed of the child to whom the ghost comes, and whom they are murdering by inches in such insufferable heat and stench. We heard nothing. They told us that it would not come that night till 7 in the morning, that is, when there are only apprentices and old women.
The skepticism patent in this letter was shared by all thinking men. Letter after letter of criticism, even of abuse, was poured into the newspapers. Oliver Goldsmith wrote, under the title of The Mystery Revealed, a long pamphlet which was intended both to explain away the disturbances and to defend the luckless Knight. The actor David Garrick dragged into a prologue a rhyming and sneering reference to the mystery. The artist Hogarth invoked his genius to deride it. Finally the unlucky child was swung up in a kind of hammock, her hands and feet extended wide, and, for 2 nights, no noises were heard. Next day she was told that if there were no noises, she and her father would be committed to Newgate. She accordingly concealed a little board, a piece of wood 6 inches by 4. She managed this with so little art that the maid saw her place the wood in her dress, and informed the investigators of the circumstances. Knight now resolved to try to slay by legal process the ghost that had rendered him the most unhappy and the most talked of man in London. Going before a magistrate, he brought a charge of criminal conspiracy against Clerk Parsons, Mrs. Parsons, Fraser the parson's servant, the clergyman who had aided the servant in eliciting the murder story from the talkative ghost, and a Cock Lane tradesman. He alleged that all of these had banded themselves together to ruin him. Their malice arose from the quarrel which had led him to remove to Clerkenwell and enter a lawsuit against Parsons. The girl herself he did not desire punished because she was too young to understand the evil that she wrought. Warrants were forthwith issued, and protesting their innocence frantically, the accused were dragged to prison. Their conviction soon followed, after a trial of which the only obtainable evidence is that it was held at the Guildhall before a special jury and was presided over by Lord Mansfield. The court desiring that Knight, who had been so much injured on this occasion, should receive some reparation, sentence was deferred for several months. This enabled the clergyman and the tradesman to purchase their pardon by the payment of some £500 or £600 to night. But the clerk either would not or could not pay a farthing, and on him sentence was now passed. He was ordered to be set in the pillory 3 times in 1 month, once at the end of Cock Lane, and after that to be imprisoned 2 years. Elizabeth his wife, 1 year, and Mary Fraser, 6 months to Bridewell, and to be kept there to hard labor. Thus did the law solemnly and severely place the seal of disbelief on the Cock Lane ghost, which, it is worth observing, seems to have vanished forever the moment the arrests were made. But looking back at the case from the vantage point of chronological distance, it is difficult to accept as final the verdict reached by the special jury and concurred in by the public opinion of the day. It is difficult to suppose that for so slight a cause as a dispute over £12 Clerk Parsons and his associates would conspire to ruin a man's reputation and if possible to take his life, and still more preposterous to imagine that they would adopt such a means to attain this end. Of course, they may have had stronger reasons for being hostile to Knight than appears from the published facts. Yet it is significant that when the clerk was placed in the pillory he seemed to be out of his mind, and so evident was his misery that the assembled mob, instead of using him ill, made a handsome collection for him. The more likely solution of the problem is that he, his fellow sufferers and Knight himself were one and all the victims of the uncontrollable impulses of a hysterical child. She was strongly attached to the unfortunate Mrs. Knight, doubtless felt keenly the separation from her, and whether consciously or subconsciously, would cherish a grudge against Knight as the cause of that separation. The news of Mrs. Knight's death would come as a great shock and might easily act as the fulcrum of the lever of mental disintegration. Then, dimly enough at first but soon with portentous rapidity, her disordered consciousness would conceive the idea that her friend had been murdered and that it was her duty to bring the slayer to justice. Now, for the first time, her faculties would seem to her astonished parents to be in the keeping and under the control of an extraneous being, a departed, disembodied spirit. In this error she and they would be confirmed by the suggestions and foolish questions of those who came to marvel. It needed another great shock of the arrest and imprisonment of her parents to effect at least partial reintegration and the consequent disappearance of the much debated, malevolent Cock Lane ghost.